Chapter 5. ZEND, former incarnation of Jesus. And Zoroaster, the son of ZEND, who became John the Beloved. Quotations from the ZEND of Zoroaster. Commit no slander, so that infamy and wickedness may not happen unto thee. For it is said that slander is more grievous than witchcraft. Suffer no anxiety, for he who is a sufferer of anxiety becomes regardless of enjoyment of the world and of the spirit. Form no covetous desire, so that the demon of greediness may not deceive thee. Thou shouldst not become presumptuous through much treasure and wealth. For in the end, it is necessary for thee to leave it all. With enemies, fight with equity. With a friend, proceed with the approval of friends. With a malicious man, carry on no conflict, and do not molest him in any way, whatever. With a greedy man, thou shouldst not be a partner, and do not trust him with the leadership. With a foolish man, make no dispute. With a drunken man, be not seen upon the road. From an ill-natured man, receive no loan. Turn yourself not away from three best things: good thought, good word, good deed. Think purely. Speak purely. Act purely. May the Creator of wisdom teach me his ordinances through good thought, that my tongue may have a pathway. 12 World Teachers. Manly Hall. ZEND and ZOROASTER. The Edgar Cayce story of ZEND and Zoroaster is quite different from the traditional one. Edgar Cayce indicates that Zoroaster was a son of ZEND. The traditional stories and legends which have grown up about Zoroaster have no mention of ZEND, except the ancient writings which are a part of the ZEND of Zoroaster. Translated, this means commentary and text, but the word ZEND can also stand for teacher. Thus, it may be that Zoroaster was giving his father, ZEND, credit for these very teachings. Not even Ram, who brought the sacred scriptures from Atlantis into India, put such stress upon the treatment of animals as did Zoroaster. There are many rules and laws as to how a dog must be treated. With great compassion and love. Women were made equal with men. There was a great sense of justice for all people. These teachings of Zoroaster were those of ZEND, and of his grandfather, Ujjalt, who was a former incarnation of Edgar Cayce. According to the readings, Zoroaster would have been trained from childhood to seek within himself for the answers to the mysteries. From the Edgar Cayce readings, it is indicated that many of the very people who lived in early Egypt, before the flood, at the time of Hermes and Ra-Ta, Edgar Cayce chose to reincarnate at the period of ZEND and Zoroaster. We often choose to come into the body with those with whom we have been before, so that a spiritual purpose may be carried through as a group, as well as individually. The Zoroastrian teachings are dual in nature. Ahura Mazda represents the supreme light and Shaitan, the darkness. From his grandfather, Ujjalt, he would have learned many of the precepts which had been those of Ra-Ta in Egypt. From ZEND, there would have been the age-old teachings of Hermes. From Zara, his mother, he would have gained much of the intuitive force. Because of the deep happiness of his parents, when it came time for Zoroaster to take a wife, and he was to choose only one wife, he was led to the other portion of his own entity, his own twin soul. Strangely enough, there are incarnations when we deliberately choose a lifetime of suffering. With ZEND, this far happier life, with his alter ego, Zara, was, in a sense, a preparatory fife as Jeshua. If we study the ZEND of Zoroaster closely, we can see many parallels in the teachings of ZEND with the writings of Jeshua as the second Isaiah. There is no doubt that Zara, the beloved wife of ZEND, became Maria, the Hebrew mother of Jeshua. Hers was a karmic pattern from some lifetime where she had judged others too harshly, so that a like karma came upon herself. As Edgar Cayce gave, many times, the fault that we see in others is our own greatest fault. He means, simply, that in some past life embodiment we have created the same karmic pattern, or we could not behold it in others with such clarity. Maria, the grieving mother of Jeshua, then, was his inspiration for all the writings that changed the destiny of the Hebrews, which brought them out of bondage in Babylon, just as Joshua was to lead them out of captivity centuries before. In Persia, especially at the time of Zoroaster, many names were given. Seldom did a man or a woman possess one name only. Names were also symbolic. Ancient legends of Zoroaster tell that his mother, who would have been Zara, drank the sacred Haoma juice, the same as the Soma of the Hindus, and that Zoroaster was born of an immaculate conception. Rather, such was the love between ZEND and Zara that he was conceived in spiritual ecstasy. There is a point in physical communion between man and woman, especially for those who are eternally mated throughout the ages, when the aura itself becomes illumined. Centuries later, Mary was to give birth to Jesus, who had been ZEND, through a spiritual overshadowing. Since he was the other portion of her own entity. As the mother of Zoroaster, another name for her would have been Dugdova, but it was Zara by which she was known. And Zara was the name that ZEND, who loved her above all others on the face of the earth, chose to call her. The symbolic meaning of Zara is beloved. In his incarnations in the earth, Jesus came into each of the 5 races as a world teacher. As a child, my parents took me to Mexico to see the famous imprint of the face of Mary, the beloved mother, known as Our Lady of Guadalupe. The carefully recorded story in the Catholic archives relates to a middle-aged man, Juan Diego, who beheld the Holy Mother on a hill just northwest of Mexico City. She was dark, with great lustrous eyes, wearing the blue mantle with which she is so often depicted. She asked him to return, and on the following day, he saw her again. She asked him to pick roses in the snow. In a trance-like state, he saw that there was a great rose bush growing with perfumed spring-like blossoms. She wished for a church to be built, depicting her as she was at that moment. As she appeared to Juan Diego, as a beautiful young woman who could have been Mexican. When Juan Diego rushed to his priest to tell the fantastic tale, fearing that he would be thought insane, the mantle which she had given him to carry the roses held upon it her imprint. That of a lovely young woman, with dark eyes and hair. The Church of Guadalupe was built upon that spot where she requested it. For those who do not wish to accept miracles. And miracles are about us, still. The logical explanation would be that somehow Juan Diego painted such a portrait of the Lady of Guadalupe. He also found budding roses in the snow. William Randolph Hearst, who was enchanted with this story from boyhood, decided to test its accuracy several decades ago. He engaged the best-known artists of that time, most of whom were non-Catholic. All of whom were skeptics. He invited them to the Church of Guadalupe to examine the heavenly painting and to determine just how Juan Diego accomplished this so-called miracle. Weeks of testing ensued, and one conclusion was reached by these artists who were, for the most part, non-Catholic. Their conclusions were that the substance which was used in the painting was something which has never been found in the earth. There was an ethereal quality about it, a luminous aura-like base which defied all the chemical tests which were put to it. In all religions, a saint by any name appears at the moment that a people need one in whom to believe, in whom to cling. The Nordic statues of Mary with blue eyes and blonde hair found no answer. No response. Within the deepest heart of the Mexican peon-type woman. It was as if she beheld only a statue. It was difficult to look upon this doll-like creature and believe that she had ever known the pangs of childbirth. The agony of bereavement. The loss of sight or limb or hope. Few Catholic artists in the 16th century had depicted Mary, the beloved mother, as being dark of countenance. In actuality, Mary, the mother of Jesus, was blue-eyed with golden hair, with just a touch of reddish hue. She was not unlike the women of Galilee who were known for their blue eyes, light skin, blonde or reddish or auburn hair. Maria, the mother of Jeshua, was very dark, with deep luminous eyes and brown-toned skin. Zara, perhaps, fits the painting of Our Lady of Guadalupe better than any other known incarnation. I have not seen her since childhood. I remember my own eyes standing before her in that church in Mexico. I had a Sunday school paper from the Methodist Church in my pocket. It was Sunday afternoon, and I had spent the afternoon reading it as we drove to the Church of Guadalupe. Somehow, to my 12-year-old eyes, there was a truth in this painting. It appears to be dark, but the luminous quality, discovered by the painters, is very evident. In the turquoise mantle of the lady, the rose-pink gown embroidered in gold, the tiny crown upon her head, she could be Persian, Mexican, Indian, or East Indian. Zend was far from a poor man in the city of the hills and plains. It is my belief that Sarah once wore such a costume, or it may be that she had another embodiment in the Mexican land for a short period. There are some versions of the story which say that the lady's image was imprinted upon the cloak of Juan Diego. Even the material seems ageless. In appearing to him that cold December 9, 1531, she brought hope to the thousands of women who had known the sorrows of life in the body. As they beheld her, seemingly, a young girl about 15 or slightly older, they could see themselves. She was the eternal mother, the one who had known all of pain and suffering. The one who could understand their own plights and problems. I believe, truly, that Juan Diego had a vision nearly 500 years ago, and that it was a true semblance of the one who became Mary. Sarah. Maria. Mary. Seshet. By any name, she was the same entity throughout her sojourns in earth. As Asenath, the Egyptian wife of Joseph, she was also very dark and of great beauty. For some reason, Mary chose to come many times as the mother of the entity who was Jesus. Even in the Nubian land, Hermes, or Mer-O, was her son. She lived to be only 26 years old, so that early in his boyhood she became a memory. After he followed Ra-Ta back into the Egyptian land, and after years of study, he was to meet her again, as Seshat or Seshata. She became his much younger wife. The Greeks chose to call her Aphrodite, but her Egyptian name was Seshata. In leaving him again, after a few years of marriage, she overshadowed him from the spiritual planes. In this sense, we are never alone. Never separated from the other portion of our entity, or that called twin soul, for in sleep, we are always with the beloved of the spirit, if we so choose to be. If the alter ego is in a body vehicle, in sleep, those who are eternally one find themselves. In Switzerland, in a small Catholic church, I stood before a Black Madonna. I had been asked to give a series of lectures in London, as well as Dublin. I had no idea that I would be expected to give as many as 7 a day. When I reached Switzerland, on tour with a large group of people, I was exhausted. When everyone piled out of the bus, in some small town for coffee, I walked to the top of the hill to a small Catholic church. It was there that I saw the Black Madonna, with the sun shining directly upon her from the great upper window. I was fascinated. Again, there was this feeling of eternal truth. At that point, I did not know, even, that Hermes was Nubian. I supposed that he had been an Egyptian who followed Ra-Ta, who was Edgar Cayce in this lifetime, into exile into Nubia, and who returned with him 9 years later. Weeks later, when that long and exhausting tour was over, it was in London that I found a medium. Although I would term her a great clairvoyant, who was able to give me the story of Hermes through, I believe, Edgar Cayce. When I returned to London last year, I could not locate her, and someone else now lives in the tiny house where I found her in Paddington. That morning, in Switzerland, I knew, somehow. It was true. There had been a Black Madonna, just as there had been a Black Christos. Somewhere, sometime, someplace. When I asked the young priest in the vestibule about her, he explained that there had been a fire a century or more ago, and that she had been burned, scorched. Thus she was black. It was my feeling that this was not by chance. Somehow, she was meant to be black. In Italy, I saw a black infant Jesus. Very ebony black. This, too, seemed a joyous thing, and again there was that feeling of truth. Sometime, somewhere. But when? A few weeks later, I had learned the story, but it seemed that I had always known it. Zoroaster, too, was very dark. In many respects, the legends of him are similar to those of Jesus. During a time of fasting for many days on the Persian desert, he ate nothing, or only a certain sacred cheese, which is said never to grow stale or moldy. At another time, Zoroaster was said to have been in a great cave on a sacred mountain. Here, he was protected and surrounded by flames. The sacred fire, which forms a great part of the Zoroastrian teachings. Like Jesus, too, who was close to his cousin, John the Baptist. Zoroaster was said to have converted his first cousin, who had not formerly accepted the ways of Ahura Mazda. Afterwards, they were very close to each other, almost as brothers. Jesus was baptized by his cousin, John the Baptist, who entered the ministry before him. Zoroaster, and sometimes Zend, are depicted as powerfully built men who wear white robes of the initiate, and a turban-like cap is shown. Manly Hall tells the story of the priests and philosophers of the day facing Zoroaster at the court of King Vishtaspa. After 3 days of continual examination, Zoroaster emerged victorious, for he had answered their most difficult queries. Ida Hagen Marshall, the American mystic, gave me a life reading many years ago. She said that I had been a little sister of Zend, more than 10 years younger, but having his same father and mother, Ujjwal and Ilya. At that time, I knew nothing of Zend, except that he was some rather obscure teacher of Persia. At the time of the reading, the name meant nothing to me. Ida Hagen Marshall also painted a soul portrait while in a state of reverie. From the painting she gave to me, it would seem that I had lived many times in the earth at the same period of Jesus. I may have known him. I may have heard his words. The Christ was the central figure in the soul painting, and as with Jesus, his eyes were blue. His hair was golden red. For some reason, this disturbed me. I knew that Jesus was said to have looked like this. Yet, when I saw the soul painting Mrs. Marshall had done for Peter Balbish, the montage director at MGM, Jesus was very dark. Dark hair, dark eyes. Peter, too, had been close to Zend, according to the reading, and she had chosen the face of Zend. As I looked at this painting, it seemed that every feature was engraven upon my heart. That I had known him, truly, by other names, also, when he was dark of countenance. Yet, the name Zend, itself, meant little to me. When I discovered Edgar Cayce, I worked for a year to earn enough money to go to Virginia Beach to study the records. There are many psychics with valid gifts. There is one Edgar Cayce, in 7 visits to Virginia Beach for a period of weeks or months, and in one prolonged visit which lasted nearly a year, I read nearly all of the 2,500 life readings. There is no one else, to my knowledge, who possesses the amazing historical knowledge of Edgar Cayce. And in all the readings, there are few errors. I emphasize this. There are so few errors that his accuracy is, I believe, about 99.6. In my study that first summer, which grew into a cold autumn, with 2 hurricanes, I did not come across the name of Zend. I had not searched for it. In fact, I had forgotten the reading that Ida Hagen Marshall had given me. One night something happened which brought it to mind, with great intensity. As a child I lived in the Deep South. The happiest years of my life were in Jackson, Mississippi, and in Atlanta, Georgia. I grew up with a Negro nurse, called Nita. My devotion and loyalty to her was complete. She was nurse, friend, companion. Sometimes, at the age of 7, I chose to sit in the back of the bus, marked colored, as if I could not read the sign. Invariably, some conductor would come back and guide me to another seat. Invariably, I waited 5 minutes and walked back again. In Virginia Beach, I went over to the YWCA often for dinner. It was not really in Virginia Beach, but in Norfolk, which is 20 miles away. On this one afternoon I left the headquarters in bright, September sunlight. I ate a 5 o'clock dinner in Norfolk and caught the bus as a windstorm came up. 2 young Negro girls got on the bus just before we entered Virginia Beach. They sat. Not together. As they did not seem to know each other, but they sat across the aisle from each other, each occupying a window seat. This action, apparently, infuriated a sharp-nosed woman who stood up and began to give what amounted to an oration against these 2 girls. This lasted all the way from 67th Street almost to the bus terminal in the heart of town. Finally, I could bear it no longer. Some half-forgotten memory of Nita must have risen up in me. One of the girls had her face buried in her hands. She was sobbing uncontrollably as the woman continued her outburst. The other girl stared, solemn-faced, out of the window, as if she were in another world far beyond the words of this tirade. as the woman suddenly pounded her fist against the back of my seat, shouting. I turned to her and began to talk. Where the words came from, I don't know. They came pouring out, and I could not stop them. I told her, in effect, that her hatred had nothing to do with these two girls. It began long ago, long ago. As a child. She hated her father, or was it her mother? She could not face her own hatred, and it translated itself into racial prejudice. As we drove into the bus terminal, she raised up her hand. As if to me. I dashed out of the bus. For some reason I was terrified. The autumn day had turned into deepest winter. The light wind had shifted. And as it began to grow stronger, someone shouted that it was a hurricane. To get inside, I ran toward the old KC house on Arctic Circle. The wind grew stronger. And twice I fell. Just as the house was in sight, the hurricane hit with full force, and I fell to my knees and began to crawl. I could not stand the blast of the wind. I wondered if I were to die out there. Just a few feet from the ARE steps. Finally, I made it. But at that moment, time seemed to shift. And in an instant, I was a child running through the hills of Persia. I was lost. My mother and brother had gone ahead of me. Had they forgotten me? The same terror that enveloped me in the present had enveloped me in that long ago past. I heard and saw the child, dark of skin. She, too, could no longer run against the wind. She, too, had fallen to her knees. And from her throat came a cry that I shall never forget. Zend. 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 In a moment a tall boy was by her side. His eyes were so huge that they seemed pools of light. He picked her up in his arms, and she leaned against him, in safety and in warmth. This was her brother. This was her brother, Zend, who out of all the world, would see that she came to no harm. At that moment, a woman came running. A huge woman whose skirts swirled about her. The woman was familiar. It seemed that I knew her. As I opened the door of the headquarters, a study group was in process in the living room, despite the raging elements outside. The woman who was teaching it, Anna, had blonde hair and blue eyes. She no longer weighed 200 pounds. She looked at me and said something about the hurricane. And I recognized her. It was the woman of the vision. The mother of Zend. As I sat beside her, it was as if I were still a terrified child of long ago. She was the mother of Zend. The mother of this beautiful young man, whose face and eyes were filled with light. And little by little, it was as if the present receded into the past. I could remember him. I could even hear his words of long ago. I could see him teaching. I knew his quick smile, his ready wit, his love for people. He was the brother who had turned back to take the little sister into his own strong arms. And the woman beside me, this woman whom I scarcely knew, had been my mother. A few days later I offered to type some of the life readings for the Edgar KC files. They were listed by number, not by name. As I fingered through the many past lives of various individuals, one of the readings stood out, above all others. I knew that this was the reading of Anna. There were many lifetimes given, far more than for any other reading I had seen. As I read through these, quickly, finally I came to the portion which I knew must be there. As if written in letters of light, it read, simply, that Anna had been the wife of Ujlt, the mother of Zend. Apparently, there was rather an advanced form of government in the city of the hills and plains, in the era of Ujlt and Zend. There were hospitals which cared for those who were sick. Confucius is said to have introduced the first civil service to the world, but here in this golden city, set on the plains, with the sun-swept hills as a backdrop, there were laws which were in effect, which protected those who might be exploited by their fellow men. At the time of Zoroaster, women were said to have had a unique place in the society, almost in equality with man. Many of the ancient precepts from the Temple Beautiful and the Temple of Sacrifice were an inner part of the teachings of Ujlt, Zend, and Zoroaster. It was a time, however, when there was great jealousy between certain tribes or groups of people. Edgar KC, himself, as Ujlt, would have died upon the battlefield. The reading describes a place of the three palms. Here, he had been wounded and left to die in great agony. Sometime before his death, in seeking to escape the physical pain, he willed himself to leave the body. In leaving the body, he gained the great clairvoyance which has been his in each lifetime since that day beneath the three palms. It was in this lifetime that Edgar Cayce earned the right to enter Arcturus, which is the next port of call out of the solar system. This is a matter of choice for the soul. If it wishes, it may begin its long journey through other dimensions, or it may choose to return to Earth for the purpose of aiding its fellow man. This, Edgar Cayce chose to do, and he has used his gifts in many lifetimes. Many years ago in a deep meditation session, I saw Edgar Cayce enter the courtyard of the Regent of France, Catherine de' Medici. I saw myself as a small child, perhaps 6 years of age, who ran toward him, speaking in rapid French, while he took me into his arms and embraced me. I did not know him by the name of Edgar Cayce, however. I knew that he was the great physician astrologer, Nostradamus. Those who were brought together in the city of the hills and plains, then, had been together in many incarnations. The temple beautiful and the temple of sacrifice had existed thousands of years before. There had been many incarnations for those individuals since that time. Yet, in the city where ZEND and ZOROASTER were to be born, once again this soul group, those who had lived at the time of Ra-Ta and Hermes, found themselves drawn together again to fulfill the purpose for which they had entered the earth in the beginning. That there might be one God worshipped and loved within the heart of man. In a vision, Zoroaster writes of the angel of good thought, taking him into the very presence of the wise Lord, Ahura Mazda. In this vision, Ahura Mazda, the Supreme Being, who was to appoint Zoroaster as a prophet of his people, instructed Zoroaster as to the teachings which are found in the Gathas, a portion of the sacred book of the Zoroastrian faith, the Avesta, or Zend Avesta. Briefly, if a man lived a good life, if he followed the highest concepts within himself, at death he would be rewarded. But if a man let evil predominate in his lifetime, for all time after death, he would be a guest for the house of the lie. Each individual must cross the bridge of the separator. At one end of this bridge, the road leads to paradise. At the other end, the abyss of hell. All of man's life, he must choose between good and evil, so that on the day of his death, he might cross the bridge of the separator into paradise. In the words of the Gathas, in the beginning, two primal spirits, who revealed themselves in visions as twins. These are the better and the bad in thought and word and action. When these twin spirits came together in the beginning, they established life and not life. The worst existence, hell, shall be to the followers of the lie, but the best thought, paradise, to him that follows the right. Again, I will speak of the spirits, twain at the first beginning of the world, of whom the holier thus spake to the enemy, Shaitan or Satan. Neither thought nor teachings nor wills, nor beliefs, nor words, nor deeds, nor selves, nor souls of us twain agree. For eons, even in Atlantis, it was known in the mystery schools that within man, himself, Ahura Mazda, the spirit of light, and Shaitan, the spirit of darkness, exist. In Deuteronomy 30, which we find recommended over and over by Edgar Cayce as a watchword for each day. Choose ye, this day, whom ye will serve, good or evil. In the 40 days of temptation in the wilderness, when he was alone, except for the presence of Andrew, the disciple, who stayed close by, Jesus would have seemed to have wrestled with the angel of light and the angel of darkness. Were these beings outside of himself? Or were these a part of his own consciousness? In the first temptation after many days of hunger, Jesus was told that he, by his own power, could change the very stones into bread. In refusing to do this, Jesus overcame the physical temptation. In the second instance, Satan took Jesus into the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple. Here, he was told, he could throw himself down, and angels would bear him upon their hands. The meaning here is clear. Few of the people had yet accepted Jesus as a prophet, much less as the Son of God. If he allowed himself to descend in great glory, all the earth would behold his magnificence. In refusing to succumb to this temptation, Jesus overcame the mental temptation, the spirit of pride within himself which exists within all mankind. It is a paradox that man earns the right to be born into a high place from a material standpoint through many lifetimes of humbleness and givingness of self to others. Yet, in one lifetime, much less a series, in a position of great authority, pride may again become an integral part of the consciousness. Once again, there can be the long hill to be climbed again. In one of his thousands of readings relating to the purpose of man in the earth, Edgar Cayce indicated that selfishness is the great weakness of all. In another reading, he designated spiritual vanity as the greatest of all errors. Jesus pointed this out also when he described the man who prayed, sincerely, "God be merciful to me a sinner," as nearer the kingdom of heaven than the much more righteous individual who stood upon the street corners to pray, so that all might behold his goodness. The past lives of Jesus brought just as many temptations, perhaps even greater, as come to all men. Thus, he was tempted that day on the mount by those things which had been most difficult for him in past embodiments. The prophet within him was certainly aware that his beloved cousin, John, the Baptist, not the disciple, John, the beloved, was soon to be imprisoned and then beheaded. He was aware, too, that even this John was to ask him, as would the Essenes, if he were the one for whom those of the mystery schools had waited so long. Jesus knew, too, that although the rabbis and teachers were impressed by him, they murmured that he was just another charlatan with a few magic tricks. How could this humbly born son, they said, of a carpenter of Nazareth, be the long-awaited Messiah? Oh, certainly there had been rumors on the night of his birth. A few drunken shepherds imagined they saw angels in the heavens. 3 rich men had come all the way from Persia because the stars had foretold his birth. Zoroastrians. Slightly mad. Astrologers and soothsayers and drunken shepherds. So the rumors went. They had seen no especial miracles. If this should be the Messiah, let him descend out of the heavens. Then, all can see. All can believe. Mary, too, who had known the miracles surrounding his birth, who, perhaps, expected some greater outer manifestation of kingship, was to question him, once. Even she, who had been with him throughout the ages. But, knowing all of these things, Jesus answered Satan, "Thou shalt not tempt the Lord, thy God." At that time and place, for angels to have borne him, would have brought all men to his feet. It was what would be expected of a Messiah. David and Moses and the prophets of old would attest to his sonship. But he answered, only, "Thou shalt not tempt the Lord, thy God." The final temptation was by far the most difficult. Jesus had been the great one of Atlantis. All had known it. There had been no doubt. In other embodiments, he had also trod the place of the mighty in the earth. But when the angel of darkness, whether the angel of darkness was an external being or the Shaitan within him, took him to the high mountain, or to the high place in thought, the high place in consciousness, and showed him all the kingdoms of the world, and the glory of them, and said, "All these things will I give thee, Jesus, if thou wilt, but fall down and worship me." Jesus answered only, "It is written, Thou shalt not tempt the Lord, thy God." Again, had Jesus not been a great Atlantean ruler? In Egypt, had he not been Hermes, who thrust aside the veil of the mysteries? Had he not known power and glory in past embodiments? Once again, yet once again, he was being told that with his knowledge, with his innate understanding of the mysteries, all things could be his. He could be emperor of the world. There was only one condition. He must choose to fall down and worship Satan, the drives within him which had brought him to the high places in the earth. He could be greater than all the Caesars, or any to come after them. The thought, even for an instant, must have come to him. Why not? Had he not spent lifetimes giving of himself to others? Had he not entered the physical vehicle again and again so that he might take upon himself the cross of mankind? Surely, 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 now, he deserved to end his mission in the earth in power and acceptance and glory. Could he not, if he were in a high position, if he were a temporal king of kings, succor all men? Would he not give to the poor, far more with great riches? Enact humane laws? Build magnificent structures for his people? If the Father loved him, was it not possible that the Father wished him to have all material wealth? What wrong would there be in becoming the noblest of worldly rulers? Could he not serve God through power and wealth? Certainly, he had entered the body. He had chosen to come that all men might know themselves brothers. That they might love God with all their hearts and their neighbors as themselves. But was it necessary to be just a lowly teacher in Palestine? Surely, greater things could be accomplished through the power of the world. And all could be given him. If he would only worship this one. Satan. The angel of darkness. All would be given him. Why did he hesitate? Why could he not respond to this great mission as the most compassionate ruler of the world? Surely, it could be a gift from the Father, could it not? But wait. Wait. Listen, within yourself. Is not life in the body, whatever the position, a time of imprisonment of the self? What does it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? How far would be the road back again, to Jesus, born in Nazareth? How many incarnations? How many times again would the self be crucified until he came into the consciousness of Jesus, who had come into the body for one purpose only? All men would someday die. All worldly power must end. Once, long ago, he knew. He remembered in the chalice of his heart. He had failed. It was written in the book of life, and it was engraven within his own soul. Should he take this way of power again? Even the disciples wished him to take the road of worldly glory. They would not know he had failed in his mission. Only he would know. Only he. Whether the Satan, the angel of darkness, was within himself or without himself, he could not worship it. He could not. And, in this moment of decision, he turned, for all time, from self to self. In this moment, he became the Christ. And Jesus answered Satan, "The Lord, thy God, shalt thou worship, and only him shalt thou serve." And only him. Not self, but him. Then, Satan left him, and behold, angels came and ministered unto him. ZEND. Who became Jeshua? The date of Zoroaster's birth, the son of ZEND, is believed to have been about 660 BC. ZEND, himself, would have entered the body about 680 BC. Jeshua, then, who was writing to Cyrus, the Persian warlord, in 538 BC. Would have been born, no doubt, about 570 BC. There would have been a little more than a century between the birth of ZEND and the birth of his successor. His next incarnation. Jeshua. A little more than a century. If we think, for a moment, of Jeshua, who had been ZEND, intense young prophet, writing to Cyrus, the conqueror, and prophesying his future, we might know that ZEND spoke, too, from the heart of Jeshua. Cyrus, the Persian king, was a follower of Zoroaster. As he read the scrolls of Jeshua, begging for the release of the captive Jews in Babylon, did some memory of ZEND, or Zoroaster, stir within Cyrus? Had he, perhaps, lived at the time of ZEND or of Zoroaster? We know from the writings of Jeshua, Deutero-Isaiah, that Cyrus had great doubts about any God-appointed mission of his to free the captives. Yet, when Jeshua writes to Cyrus, anointed of the Lord, liberator of Israel, that he is the instrument through whom the Jews will return to their homeland, Cyrus listens. Not only does he listen, but he finances the journey. He returns the sacred vessels to them which were carried away by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC, almost 50 years before. In all ways, he accedes to the wishes of Jeshua. Cyrus, the Persian, was a man strong of heart and strong of belief. He was capable of great ruthlessness. Yet, an unknown prophet was to beseech him for the freedom of a people, and he was to answer their need. Could it not be that Cyrus remembered, without knowing that he knew, that this young Jeshua had once been ZEND, the father of Zoroaster? It would seem so. ZEND, of the city of the hills and plains, was the son of a happy marriage. That of Ujjald and Ilya. They had been together many times in the earth. They were, perhaps, a portion of the same entity, or that which is called the alter ego. It is a well-known fact that children, whose parents love each other, whose parents have the same ideal and purpose in the earth, tend to make like marriages. ZEND was to marry at an early age to one who had always been a part of his own being, for he was to marry the entity who was to become Mary, the beloved mother. In our incarnations in the earth, we never take on a lifetime of denial, of sacrifice, such as Jeshua was to know, without a lifetime of great fulfillment. The lifetime of fulfillment may precede the life of suffering, but it may also come after it. We do not fast without having first feasted, or a feast awaits us after the fast. Zend was to know great happiness in the emotional realm of his life, if I read the Akasha correctly. Zoroaster was close to him. Perhaps it was because of the fact that Zend was contented in spirit that he allowed Zoroaster, rather than himself, to take on the mission of the one God. Since there are compensations in all things, the very frustrations of a Rembrandt, a Leonardo, a Schumann, act as an impetus to the fulfillment of a purpose in the earth. Zend did not have to prove himself. He had listened to the teachings of his father, Ujjalt, of the one God, and he had passed on these teachings to his son, Zoroaster. Perhaps Zend was aware, subconsciously, that a lifetime of great emotional suffering was ahead of him. The lifetime of Jeshua, or Deutero-Isaiah. It would seem that he lived each day at a time, as Zend. He did not wish to rush into the future, or to linger too long in the past. That for which he entered the body, to carry on the teachings of the one God, would be fulfilled. Whether by him, or by his beloved son, Zoroaster. It must be remembered that as a group, we often enter the earth to carry out a definite mission. As Ra-Ta had been with Hermes, the Nubian, in Egypt, and through each the mystery teachings were revealed. So as Zend, there was this close relationship with Ujjalt, a former incarnation of Edgar Cayce, as was Ra-Ta. In the Persian incarnations Zend chose Ujjalt for his father. But as a group, many of the same individuals reincarnated into Persia who had been with Ra-Ta and Hermes in Egypt. There had been many incarnations between, as the Egyptian period was approximately 12,500 years ago, and the Persian period was close to 660 BC. The teachings of Ra-Ta, who became Ra, were much involved with the idea of re-embodiment or reincarnation. Even with the teachings of Muhammad, there is just the suggestion of reincarnation. Muhammad once wrote of his belief that Miriam, the sister of Moses, became Mary, the beloved mother of Jesus. Whether this incarnation is authentic for Mary or not, the fact remains that Muhammad certainly accepted reincarnation. In the teachings of Zoroaster, as with the writings of John, the Beloved, there is the suggestion of reincarnation. This had already been established. Most of the world accepted reincarnation at that time. It was not necessary to re-establish or to bring forth, again, the teachings relative to reincarnation. Rather, it was necessary that man should live one day at a time. And that he should choose which twin he would serve, Ahura Mazda, the Supreme Being, or his twin, Shaitan, or Satan. Zoroaster, himself, was in love with the idea of good works on earth. It was at the age of 20 that he is said to have left the city of the hills and plains, to journey into the world to discover the individual who was most given to feeding the poor, to the feeding of lost animals, to tend the fire with wood, and who was most given to compassion for all creatures. In every sense, Zoroaster, as with Zend and Ujjalt, sought perfection. And this was to be achieved in the present life pattern, and he did not wish his followers to put off for another lifetime what they could accomplish in this one. However, if perfection was not attained in one lifetime, Zoroaster quotes the following passage from the teachings of Zoroaster. If the soul, during earthly life, does not purify itself, and remains ignorant, and cherishes any worldly desires, afterwards, it must return, and take physical bodies one after another until it is quite pure. In the writings of John, the Beloved, it is definite that he is aware of the inner teachings of the Master. In John 3, we read, "There was a man of the Pharisees, named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. The same came to Jesus by night, and said unto him, Rabbi, we know that thou art a teacher come from God, for no man can do these miracles that thou doest except God be with him. Jesus answered Nicodemus and said unto him, Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Nicodemus saith unto him, How can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter the second time into his mother's womb, and be born? Jesus answered, Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born of water, and of the Spirit, he cannot enter into the kingdom of God. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. There have been many interpretations given of these words. Jesus seems to be telling Nicodemus that to be born again is a literal truth, born of the flesh, but that there is an even greater truth. To be born of the Spirit. In one sense, there is no such thing as reincarnation, because a portion of us has never left the throne of the Father. If we could place ourselves in an entirely different dimension where time does not exist, if we could behold our lives on earth, all lifetimes would be occurring at the same moment. Yet, we, ourselves, would be in this timeless dimension viewing all of our earth lives. Truly, we are not of the earth. We are of spirit, and we have never left the Father. In the beginning, according to the readings of Edgar Cayce, we were spiritual beings, androgynous, both male and female polarity in one. We were given charge of the earth, which had been created for the animal kingdom. Because we were imaginative and creative, we partook too much of the physical in the earth, until we became enmeshed in matter, so that we could no longer wend our way back to our heavenly home. Thus, life for us in the earth began through a series of incarnations. But, were we merely of flesh? Had we not been born of the Spirit in the beginning? And was this not eternally true? Jesus continues to speak of reincarnation to Nicodemus by saying, "Marvel not that I say, ye must be born again. The wind bloweth where it listeth, and thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst thou tell whence it cometh, and whither it goeth? So is every one that is born of the Spirit." Here, it would seem that Jesus is speaking of the eternality of life, which for each one, each spiritual being, whether occupying a body of flesh or out of the body, in spirit. From whence cometh this one? Each one in the earth was born of him. The Christ, in the beginning. At some point in man's journey in the earth, he becomes aware that he is not of flesh, but that he is spirit, an eternal part of God. Nicodemus answered and said to Jesus, "How can these things be?" Jesus answered, "Art thou a teacher of Israel and knoweth not these things? Verily, verily, I say unto thee, we speak that we do know, and testify that we have seen, and ye receive not our witness. If I have told you earthly things, and ye believe not, how shall ye believe, if I tell you of heavenly things? And no man hath ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man which is in heaven." In effect, Jesus is saying to Nicodemus that all men take the same route, even the Son of Man himself. Each began the journey through the earth as a spiritual being. They came from the heavenly spheres. They were angelic beings. They were born of the Spirit of God, and of him, they are a portion forever, a corpuscle in the body of him. Ye are a corpuscle in the body of God. Edgar Cayce. Because we fell in the beginning, because we became enmeshed in matter, we have chosen to take a journey in the earth. There may be many days of journeying, many lifetimes in the earth, or there may be but a few days of journeying. We are encased in bodies of flesh. Our spirit is a part of his Spirit, now and forever. Race, creed, religion matter not at all. We have been in every race, every creed, every religion, but at the end of the long journey, we return to him, of which we have been a part since the beginning. Jesus is saying that if Nicodemus, who, apparently, is seeking for the answers of life purely from a mental or intellectual standpoint, cannot comprehend earthly things, how can he understand the things of the Spirit? Certainly, one of the disciples understood the meaning clearly. And that disciple was John, the beloved, who had been Zoroaster. If we remember that an early incarnation of Jesus was Melchizedek, we know that John, the beloved, also knew this when he writes in John 8:58. Jesus said, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am." We remember that Abraham supped with Melchizedek, king of Salem, and brought forth bread and wine, and Melchizedek was the priest of the Most High God, possessor of the earth. As Edgar Cayce gave, Jesus, born in Bethlehem of the Virgin Mary. No, this is the same entity who had manifested to Father Abraham, as the prince, as the priest of Salem, without father, without mother, without days or years, but a living human being in flesh, made manifest in the earth from the desire of Father God, to prepare an escape, are of bondage in the earth, for man. John understood that Jesus was saying that he had been Melchizedek, and many years later, on the Isle of Patmos or at Ephesus, about the year 100 AD, he wrote of Jesus having been Melchizedek. Of all the disciples, Jesus chose to call this one his beloved disciple, perhaps because John understood the teachings of Jesus which he could not give, even to the other disciples, because they were not yet able to bear them. Not only did he speak of earthly things to John, those things which could be touched and seen and understood by the many, but he spoke of the mysteries, of the heavenly things, for had not John been his own son, as Zoroaster? The mystery schools have always taught that despite many names and many incarnations in the earth, the soul possesses an eternal name. We remember that Jacob, when he wrestled with the angel, was told that his name should no more be called Jacob, but Israel, and Israel would be his eternal name, however many incarnations he should choose to take upon himself in the earth. John was aware of this when in Revelation 3:12 he wrote, "Him that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go no more out. I shall write upon him a new name." John, too, is speaking of leaving the heavenly home and re-entering the earth in another body. And, the one who overcomes his own weaknesses shall go no more out. Edgar Cayce gives Arcturus as the next port of call out of the solar system, and love, as Zoroaster gave, love for all men, for all creatures of the earth, is the key which unlocks the prison door which holds us enchained. If we stand beneath the heavens, we behold 1,000 stars. And if life is eternal, there are many other spheres, far removed from the sorrows of earth, where we will find ourselves, for we shall go no more out. According to Edgar Cayce, when a soul has evolved to the place in consciousness where it can go on to Arcturus, there is an opportunity for a choice. If it so desires, it can return to earth for another incarnation, or more likely, a series of incarnations, in order to help its fellow man. If the twin soul, or the other portion of the entity, is not yet ready for Arcturus, the soul may decide to return to earth. Primarily, its purpose would be to help all mankind. In returning, it is not aware, as a rule, that it is different from any other. A man who has much of the little boy in him may be an Arcturian soul. A woman who has much of the little girl may be such a one. Sincerity and trust are the distinguishing characteristics of the old soul. Innate within the Arcturian soul is great love for his fellow creatures. There may also be greater creativity, or awareness within the individual. It must be remembered, however, that the old soul may be the extremist soul. In one reading which Edgar Cayce gave, he pinpointed the possibility of extremes within the individual. Always in need of money, or very rich. Always hating, or always loving. Good health or ill health. Anger or compassion, etc. Because the old soul is an extremist, Edgar Cayce also gave in several readings that he may succeed beyond success, or fail beyond failure. Perhaps, more for the Arcturian soul than for any other, there must be the following of the precepts of ZEND and ZOROASTER or of Deuteronomy 30. Choose ye this day whom ye will serve, or else, the long, long hill to be climbed again. If John, the beloved, had been Zoroaster, the founder of a religion in the past, we might ask about the incarnations of the other disciples. From the Akasha, there was not one who had not been in a high place in the earth. John, Peter, Andrew, and Philip had been pharaohs in early Egypt. One of the disciples had been a teacher in Greece, Socrates, but before he was Socrates, he was Phoebus Apollo. As Phoebus Apollo, he founded a mystery school, and the symbol, the watchword, engraven upon the temple was Know Thyself. As Socrates, he borrowed from Apollo and used the same phrase, Know Thyself. Here, again, we have the extremes. Phoebus Apollo dedicated his temple to the study of meditation, the healing arts, and music. Legend says, and it seems to be borne out by the Akasha, that great good was accomplished in this temple, but that Phoebus, himself, was overly jealous. He could not bear to be second in any phase of his existence. At one time a great festival of music was held above Lake Nemo in that place which was to become Rome. for Phoebus and his twin sister, Phoebe, or Artemis Diana, spent many years in these hills. Phoebus believed that he, himself, was the greatest musician, but a man came from the valley who excelled him. Phoebus Apollo could not bear that such a man, a mere shepherd, should outdistance him in the playing of the flute. He had the man crucified, and crucifixion was prevalent at this time. He was tied with ropes and left to hang for days. During the persecution of the early Christians, this same disciple made his way to Constantinople after first following the journeys of Ulysses and preaching in each of these places, records of Greek Catholic Church. And here, in Constantinople, he was crucified in precisely the same manner. Phoebus Apollo was in many ways as much of a student as Socrates, and he was the same type of teacher, asking questions of his followers, giving them impetus to seek out truths for themselves. Phoebus Apollo was so beautiful in body, in face and feature, that when the followers of Buddha wished to find someone to represent him after his death, since Buddha had refused to let himself be depicted in flesh, they took the face of Apollo, the first Apollo. Yet, because of his innate jealousy which had been with him for many lifetimes, he could not bear for anyone to become greater than he in his own particular fields, nor could he put aside pride because of the beauty of his physical appearance. As Socrates, he was not born into a beautiful body, and his facial features were almost grotesque. So much so that he was described by his young adherents as the beautiful monster. The fact that the word beautiful was used indicates that these very students may have been with him as Apollo. Jesus was not unaware of the strengths and of the weaknesses of his disciples. He knew, too, that despite their humble backgrounds in this one incarnation, they had been in high places in the earth. They had attained these places, karmically, through loving humility and service to their fellow man. But, what if Jesus had set out to give each disciple a history, so to speak, of his own past lives in the earth? What would have been accomplished? In the present lifetime, they were in humble circumstances with the exception of the sons of Zebedee. Edgar Cayce indicated the family of Zebedee had fishing fleets and were wealthy. Each of them was resentful of the authority of Rome. Even Peter carried a hidden weapon with him, so that on the night of the betrayal of Jesus, quick-tempered Peter is said to have cut off the ear of a Roman soldier. If reincarnation had been discussed on a personal level, the whole purpose of their entry into the earth in this incarnation would have been defeated. They were born into Palestine at this time when it was under suppression, and as they had suppressed others, so were they suppressed. Which Egyptian pharaoh did not make some mistake in the handling of his people? Whatever is set into motion will be met by the individual, and the tragic deaths of 11 of the disciples did not come by chance. Could Jesus tell them of the days of their power and glory? Had not 2 of his disciples already requested, through their mother, that they be allowed to sit at his right and left hand when he came into his power? Did he not know that the story of the journey in the earth is one of extremes? Had not these very disciples been close to him in past lives? As friend and foe. I repeat, as friend and foe? It was necessary that he speak symbolically. It was necessary that he speak even in parables. But there are instances where Jesus did pinpoint past incarnations, even for the disciples. In Matthew 16, we read, "When Jesus came into the coasts of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, 'Whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?'" Here, Jesus is speaking in the terminology of the day. He is asking them again, what past life personality the people believe him to be. And they said, "Some say that thou art John, the Baptist." At this point, the disciples first tell Jesus that many people do not believe that John, the Baptist, has been beheaded. Rather, they are saying that he has returned to preach in the cities. Certainly, it is a rumor that John has been beheaded, but rumors are prevalent in Palestine. A rumor can grow up overnight and can sweep the country. If Jesus were not John, the Baptist, they ask themselves, why did he visit the same kinspeople? It was rumored that they were first cousins, which would account for their similarity of feature, but who can know whether this is true or not? Does this Jesus not speak in like manner to John, the Baptist? Perhaps, with a little more authority? He has just learned a little more. He is not such a fanatic. He doesn't run around like a wild man in the desert, but, of course, this is John, the Baptist. Who can know what really happened that night at the court of Herod? They released him, no doubt. Money can do anything, and he has powerful friends. Same looks. Same kinspeople. John, the Baptist, who else? Then, the disciples continue as to what people are saying about who Jesus really is, if he is not John, the Baptist. Some say that thou art Elijah. And others, Jeremiah, or one of the other prophets. Jesus saith unto them, But whom say ye that I am? And Simon Peter answered and said, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Whatever your incarnations, Lord, I know. For my heart is filled with it. And with my love for you. Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered, Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father, which is in heaven. Simon Bar-Jonah. Simon, son of Jonah. Simon Peter, once thou wert Jonah. See, have you lived before? By Ernest C. Wilson. If we go forward into the lifetime of Jeshua, which came directly after the lifetime of ZEND, we know that it was one of great heartache for the writer who came to be called Deutero-Isaiah. There are strong indications here that Jeshua was half Persian, half Jewish, and that his mother was a wife who had been refused, as Jeshua wrote of Jerusalem. ZEND had been married to that one who was to become Mary, the beloved mother. Yet in the incarnation as Jeshua, this would have been a karmic period for each of them, for she would have been his earthly mother. Apparently, much of his lifetime was spent in sorrow for her plight. Many of his writings, if we read them truly, are meant to comfort her, whether in an early bereavement and loss of her husband, or whether in that she was refused. Yet, even in the Song of Sorrow, Isaiah 54, Jeshua promises her great fulfillment in days to come. With everlasting kindness will I have mercy on thee, saith the Lord, thy Redeemer. For the mountains shall depart, and the hills be removed, but my kindness shall not depart from thee. O thou afflicted, tossed with tempest, and not comforted. Behold, I will lay thy stones with fair colors, and lay thy foundations with sapphires. Fear not, for thou shalt not be ashamed. Neither be thou confounded, for thou shalt not be put to shame. For thou shalt forget the shame of thy youth, and shalt not remember the reproach of thy widowhood any more. For thy Maker is thine husband. The Lord of hosts is his name, and thy Redeemer the Holy One of Israel. The God of the whole earth shall he be called. Is Jeshua not prophesying not only a spiritual purpose for Jerusalem, but also for that grieved woman who was his mother? Can any writer write of that which is not in his own heart? Once, in a psychology class in college, we were given a subject which was abstract to write a 15-minute essay upon. The teacher, a PhD in psychology, took these abstract essays and told us incredible events of our own lives. We know that man reveals himself in all that he says and does, even when he seeks to cover up. But Jeshua was frank and open of heart, and he did not attempt to conceal anything. He compared Jerusalem and her people to the plight of his own mother. And for each of them he prophesied a glorious future. What greater good karma than to have been his mother once again in Bethlehem? Edgar Cayce tells a story that they had been twin souls throughout their incarnations in the earth. As a child, Mary had been an Essene at Mount Carmel, the original place where the school of the prophets was established. By Elijah, John, the Baptist, Elisha, who had been Noah, and Samuel, who taught the mysteries of man and his relationships to those forces which might manifest, within or without. Thus in Carmel, there were the maidens chosen who were dedicated to this purpose, this office, this service. There were then 12 maidens in the temple of that order called the Essenes, that were chosen as those that were to dedicate, consecrate their bodies, their minds, their service, to become a channel, through which the Prince of Peace might come. Edgar Cayce goes on to say that they were trained in the physical body. The mental exercises relating to chastity, purity, love, patience, endurance. They were given special foods, and in many ways, their regime may have equated that of the early convents. Mary, herself, was chosen to be the channel through which Jesus would be born. On this particular day, as they mounted the steps which led to the altar, as Mary reached the top step, there was thunder and lightning, and an angel led the way to the altar. Whether this story is symbolic or actual, this is very like the ancient ceremony in the Temple Beautiful in Egypt. According to Edgar Cayce, the Essene order actually laid the foundations for the church which was to follow. Jesus was born of an immaculate conception. Mary was overshadowed by the divine presence, and the Son, called Jeshua or Jesus, was conceived. Edgar Cayce gives that Jesus was known as Jeshua during this lifetime. It would seem that with the same name, there was the carrying forward of the same ideals, the same purpose in the earth. But as Jesus, Jeshua, he was to attain even the Christhood. When the question was asked Edgar Cayce, neither Mary nor Jesus had a human father? The answer was given. Neither Mary nor Jesus had a human father. They were one soul so far as the earth is concerned, because else she would not be incarnated in flesh. Mary's mother was Anna, and the original church taught that Anna also conceived Mary immaculately. Strangely enough, Edgar Cayce bears this out. This was what some of the Essenes were striving for, that a child might be born of a spiritual union or overshadowing. As for Mary not being incarnated in flesh except that she was the twin soul of Jesus, Edgar Cayce clarifies this statement in a later reading. Please explain about Mary and her refusal to reincarnate. Edgar Cayce answered by saying, "We do not find such as ever being true." This was a three-part question, and Edgar Cayce chose only to answer that portion of the question which was pertinent. The original question was, "Please explain more about Mary being the twin soul of Jesus." He had just explained this, and her refusal to reincarnate. He implied that she incarnated many times, and her deity. Her deity was the same deity as that of Jesus, the Supreme God. It is impossible to read the Akashic records without discovering that Mary had been with Jesus in many lifetimes. They had not always been together as mother and son, or sister and brother, or husband and wife, but they had experienced every type of relationship. In speaking of twin souls, Edgar Cayce has given that they are answers one to the other. In all ways, it would seem, Mary had been an answer to the spirit which had been Jesus or Jeshua in their incarnations in the pattern of the earth. The term Immaculate Conception was explained by Edgar Cayce. Immaculate Conception is as flesh in the activity of the mental being, or the spiritual self and mental being, pushing itself into matter, and as spirit. As he gave, is neither male nor female, they are then both, or one. Hence, the spirit, the soul of the master, then, brought into being, through the accord of the mother and materiality, that which ye know in the earth is conception. The conception of the body that became the child, Jesus, and through the manifesting of the spirit of the oneness of the Father, became a manifestation of the Christ spirit in material surroundings. See A Story of Jesus, Clifford P. Owens or Edgar Cayce on Jesus, Jeffrey 1st. Mary and Jesus had been Adam and Eve, Joseph and Asenath, Hermes and Sisheta, Krishna and Raja, Jeshua and the mother of Jeshua, Maria, ZEND and Zora, his beloved wife. Perhaps, the final proof that Jesus spoke of reincarnation is in the writings of John, the beloved. As Jesus neared the end of his agony upon the cross, he looked down and saw John, the one disciple who had the courage to follow him, to the hill of Golgotha. The others had fled. Even Peter had denied him, thrice. Beside John, Mary, the mother of Jesus, stood weeping, her own heart torn with agony. Within her subconscious must have been the memory of many things. Had she not been the wife of Zend in the happier days in the city of the hills and plains? Did she not know, intuitively, that John, beside her, had been her son? What were her thoughts in that dark hour? Did she remember the miracle of the birth of Jesus, the night of the angels, the vision that foretold his coming? How could it all end on a hill which bore 3 crosses? What was to lie before her now? Where and how would she live? She was not entirely alone, she knew, but was she not to be separated from the one whom she loved most in all the earth? What would he have her do? Perhaps, it was at that moment that he spoke. Out of memory. Out of the depth of his love to this woman who was now his mother, who had been his wife, even during the period of ZEND. When Jesus, therefore, saw his mother and John, whom he loved, Jesus said unto his mother, Woman, behold thy son. The son of whom he spoke was John, who had been their son, as Zoroaster, in Persia. Thus saith he to the disciple, John, Behold, thy mother. This is, perhaps, the greatest story of reincarnation in all the Bible. For Mary, according to Edgar Cayce and the traditional records, had borne 2 other sons and 1 daughter, years younger than Jesus. It was not to them, the family of the present, that he gave her. It was to John, the son of the past. And from that hour, John took her into his own home. John, son of ZEND. John, who had been Zoroaster,